Hello. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for returning for our final talk of Gentleman's Journal Live. I think we've saved the best to last in many ways. We're very lucky to have Mr. Matthew Freud with us, whose company, Freuds Group, is perhaps one of the most influential in PR and comms in modern memory, and which celebrates its 40th birthday today. Well, not today, this year. So we're thrilled to have him here, and especially because Matthew very rarely does interviews, in fact. I think
You're about to find out why.
Right. We've been trying to get him to do something with Gentleman's Journal for decades, so this is brilliant, and to do it in front of all of you is even better. So we'll chat for a bit, and then we're going to throw it out to the crowd for any questions. But why don't we begin 40 years ago, 1985, when you first set up Freud's. You were 21 years old. Do you remember the first day, hour one of business? What were you like back then?
It was a very long time ago. I remembered getting on my motorbike and I was working. I'd had a job in a record company when I was 19 or something, and I'd left to join a really motley crew of people who were trying to put on a concert in Hiroshima to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the bomb. And it was a guy called Peter Grant, who was the legendary manager of Led Zeppelin. And they'd raised a bunch of money, and it didn't work. And so the job I'd left a record company for then asked me to do it as a consultant, and I guess the first day of Freud's was me delivering an invoice to an accountant's office in Wigmore Street, and I do recall the invoice was not paid.
Okay.
Which was something of a forerunner of the next decade.
So that was your very first client?
Uri Geller.
Okay. Wow.
The spoon bender was who I'd met through the Japanese thing. Was either he or an Irish humming band called Clannad.
Wow, okay.
Would go toe to toe for being the first client.
Uri Geller, what were you trying to do with him? You were trying to bend his own image, perhaps we'll say.
I think everyone had seen him bend a spoon, because he'd been doing it at that point for about 20 years. And he believed that he could psychically divine for gold and oil and minerals.
Could he?
So we got paid a lot of money by an Australian mining company for him to go and try.
Wow.
It was only the first 2 or 3 months of the company, and I sort of negotiated this deal with an enormous advance and royalties, and I just thought, God, business is easy. I thought if I can just do 2 or 3 of these deals a year, I'll be fine.
Great.
But never saw another one.
Okay, that's an auspicious start. You were 21 years old,
yeah,
which is young to start anything. Did you think that there's some sort of power in that naivety that in the youth there?
I mean, I didn't have a lot to lose. I sort of fallen into PR completely by accident, and I thought it was probably a mistake. But I did think that the entertainment industry, where PR did a lot of the heavy lifting, so most of the awareness around films and TV and music came from PR rather than advertising, and I think probably the singular idea of Freud's was to try and take the creativity of entertainment PR and shift it over to brands, and that's pretty much what we did for the first 20 years.
Right. What was your first office like? Was it just you and a phone?
Me, a phone, a cat.
Right.
Yeah, it was in my front room for the first year and a half, and then in various little offices around Soho, and I guess startups then were, there was certainly no investment culture. So I think now people who are thinking of starting a business, write a business plan and go out and try and find investment. I think I think in the 80s it was, and before it was much more organic and much less financially driven. There were, you did whatever you could to, keep going and build it. And
Yeah. What was the PR landscape like back then? And in what way has it changed, you think, most markedly in this past 40 years?
I mean, it was thin. There were just 4 TV channels. I mean, there'd been 3. I mean, I think Channel 4 launched in '82 or something. There was, a handful of newspapers that mostly covered news, entertainment and the sort of lighter stuff was at the back of a paper. There was one entertainment column a week in the Sun on Fridays. There was a daily one in the Evening Standard, and there was a handful of magazines. So it was the sort of spectrum of outlets that you had was limited and had a pretty high criteria for what was news and what wasn't. And I think what I saw over the first 15 years was the blurring of the lines of architecture of media. So the architecture was very clear, was news. There was some comment, but it would have a name or a columnist who was writing it, and then there were features. And then I think as newspapers stopped primarily disseminating news, because that was coming from radio and TV, they started putting entertainment more towards the front of the book. So I think we rose on a tide of a much lower bar of entry.
Yeah.
And I think by the 90s that almost the entire UK media landscape had pivoted towards very trivial celebrity coverage.
Yeah, because
and
fame
represented lots of very trivial celebrities. So.
Right, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Fame was very different there. The idea of reputation was very different. Let's take the case of someone like Marco Pierre White then. To what extent is someone like him, he existed exactly as that, and you just got the cameras to take photos of him? And to what extent did you shape and form some of that persona and that personality and help him build up to be that kind of rock star of cooking?
Not at all. I'm not much for either sort of looking backwards or sort of trying to analyze or find themes or threads in what we've done, because I think the way we've endured for so long is to be very focused on what we're doing now. But I think the one thing I've done consistently and well over the period of 4 decades was to choose who I work with, and obviously who I didn't. I think someone like Marco was obviously a personality who had, I mean, he was insanely talented as a chef, but he also looked great, and he was controversial, and he was mouthy, and I don't know that I've ever aspired to the sort of Svengali thing of shaping, or
right.
I think one thing that's been very clear to me over the whole period is, even through very different stages of the relationship the media have with public, is that people hear truth. The enduring figures, I think, in public life are the ones who present themselves as something very close to who they are. Mm-hmm. I think those manufactured personalities, they might briefly come into focus, but they don't stick around. And so I've always been drawn to people who had a sort of singular integrity. And I think also I never really knew what I wanted to do. And so when I met people who had a very clear sense of what they were trying to do, that it sort of felt like that was my gig. Yeah. I don't know if anyone saw The Godfather 2, but I'm one of the few people who saw that film and wanted to be Tom Hayden, who was the consigliere.
Yeah.
I kind of liked the idea of being the guy's guy.
Okay.
And I've just been lucky in the number of people who've let me help.
Yeah, absolutely. You spoke briefly about how the relationship between PR and press has changed. How's the relationship between the public and PR has changed? Are we more savvy and literate around these things, and we're more aware when perhaps we're being spun or when an image is being presented to us, perhaps?
I always thought it was a great failing when people talked about what a great PR campaign something was, because that would indicate it probably wasn't.
Okay.
Because what you want is for people to go, that's a brilliant product, or that sounds like a great film, or whatever. I think at the point where people become aware that they're being marketed to, you probably over-egged it.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, what do they say about good design is that you don't notice it. Absolutely. Let's talk about the now then, because as you say, you're very concentrated on the now. I was on your website. 2 of the pillars of the Freuds Group are love and work. That's not often, most of us don't always love our work. Why did you decide to put those 2 together?
It's actually a quote from Sigmund Freud, who said, "Love and work and love, that's all there is."
Right.
And I think the idea of loving what you do is I mean, purpose has been a major part of what we've done pretty much from the beginning. I think Live Aid was literally the first thing I sort of got involved in '85, and my brother-in-law Richard Curtis, who started Comic Relief and Red Nose Day, is a sort of constant reminder of the importance of doing whatever you do and trying to make the world a little better. So I think we've, with working with people like Geldof and then Bono and a lot of the early environmental campaigners, it felt like what minor power we might have accrued as a comms agency should be, judiciously used. And so I was always conscious of the people who worked at Freud's having something that they did during the day that would make them feel good or make them, be admired by their friend group or by their families or whatever. So I never wanted to take on work that was tedious or mindless or ultimately made them feel grubby.
Okay.
So I think it was as much about building a community at the agency of trying to get work that they could feel good about and feel proud about, and I think we never ask people to work on something that they don't fundamentally believe in or are happy and proud to do that. So love and work it's not a boast, but I think there's truth to it.
Yeah. At the same time, it must be sometimes an incredibly, inherently stressful job. People come to you with problems you need to fight in real time, people with huge personal problems as much as business challenges. Do you ever sort of feel the stress when, do you get calls at 2 a.m. with people saying, "Matthew, I need your help right now"?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's irritating. I think it's kind of a privilege.
Yeah.
Some of my most actually enduring friendships have come out of an introduction to someone who was at that existential crisis in their lives, and it's a remarkable way to meet someone when they are staring into some sort of personal or professional abyss, because there's not a lot of small talk. There's not a lot of that choreography. I've got friends who I've had for decades who I don't know as well as people who I met an hour before, because there's a ruthless honesty that's required in terms of understanding what's happened to someone and what their options are and what it looks like. So there's an inherent vulnerability in the beginning of that relationship, and yeah, it's a very compelling way to begin a relationship, which is to kind of get into the trenches with someone and be prepared to sort of see them through what is scary and debilitating in many cases.
Yeah. And so your job, the job there is friend and confidant as much as kind of advisor.
I think very often the most useful counsel you can give people is not necessarily how to deal with a situation that's in the full glare of a media inquisition, but to help them frame it and understand it and not allow it to take over. The core issue is likely to be that their relationship is falling apart. Their company is about to go bust. They're about to be arrested. People are facing a real world challenge that happens to be the subject of media coverage. And actually, it's probably easier to try and control the media optics of that situation than deal with the situation themselves. So I think there's a sort of universal piece of advice in crisis PR, which is, I'll deal with the PR side, you deal with the crisis.
Right.
But look, it's also about not being judgmental. It's about helping them understand that it's probably not personal. And when you have an aggressive media as we have in this country, they make it personal. I've used this quote so many times. I expect most people have heard it, but there was a great line from the owner of the New York Times, who was he was at my house, and I introduced him to a guy called Tony Hayward, who was the CEO of BP. And the New York Times had decided that the CEO of BP was going to lose his job after the explosion on the platform. Right? And he was the guy who said, "I want my life back," which, on the basis 17 people had died, and his accident was suboptimal. But I introduced him, and I said, "Oh, Tony, this is Arthur Sulzberger. He's the guy who gave you your life back." And Sulzberger looked at him and he went, he said, "Yeah, you fell foul of the second law of journalism. It's not your fault, it's just your turn."
Wow.
And the punchline is that we said, "Well, what's the first law of journalism?" He said, "There isn't one."
Okay, good.
But, if you get the big checks, if you get the awards, if you get the everything that comes with being a well-compensated and celebrated person, there is a piece in the small print that says at some point, you're going to, probably get put through the mill, and it isn't, because you necessarily did something terrible. It's just, your turn to get a kicking. The quicker you can get through it, the quicker you can work out whether or not it's actually done any damage. That most people, when they're faced with a crisis, the first response is, "It wasn't me." It usually was. And then the second is, "Well, what about that guy? He's much worse than me," or whatever. Yeah. Which again, also may be true, but it's not helpful. So in some cases, you need people to accept the attack. Often I've sort of said, okay, I totally get that this wasn't you, and what about all of them? But find something in your life you got away with that you should have been kicked for.
Right, nice.
And use that as a sort of karmic balance.
Okay.
So because if you're stuck in the injustice or the inequity of what's happened to you, you won't get out of this. and you'll still be arguing the point long after anyone is actually interested in whatever happened.
Yeah. And in situations like that, how often is the best advice really just to do nothing, to be silent and not give the story oxygen? If Tony Hayward had not said that sentence, we probably wouldn't remember him solely for that in many ways.
Impossible to generalize. I mean, there are some responses to a crisis which can diffuse it. The majority of them inflame it, and you sort of have to think in terms of chess, which is that whatever move you make, you need to sort of turn the board around and work out what the opponent's move on the other side of that is. So if you're trying to deny or deflect or argue the point, then there will just be a counterpoint to that, and the thing will escalate. So it's about trying to diffuse attention, which usually means a softer body language. Then sort of fists up is unlikely to provoke anything other than a fight.
Yeah, of course. And when you're watching other people who you're not advising or aren't your clients fighting these moments of crisis or PR problems, what's the kind of the cardinal sins that you see them doing that you think, oh, I wouldn't have done that?
I think engaging too early, probably. If there's a sort of hurricane blowing, you'd be advised to wait for the hurricane to blow through before you work out if the roof needs fixing or what the damage is. I think you have to recognize a media cycle and work out the point where you can probably have something close to the last word. Whereas when it's in full tilt, all you're going to do is just perpetuate the discussion and the interest.
Of course. I think a really interesting case study about the kind of work you do and the work Freuds does, which is perhaps different to traditional PR, is something like the story with Mo Farah, who I know is a friend of yours, which from beginning to the end is the most remarkable sort of tale, really. Do you want to talk to us about your kind of involvement in Mo's story and the film you made with him?
Yeah. We started working with Mo when, someone said to him the worst thing anyone can ever say, which is, you should call Matthew Freud, because he was being accused of doping because he was part of the project in Oregon where the coach that Nike had employed was clearly, bending the rules on supplements and steroids and stuff, and so I started working with him. I was utterly convinced that he wasn't doping, and over a period of a couple of years, we managed to prove that. And then a few years later, just at the point where he was retiring from sort of at the elite running circuit, he came to see me and sat down and said, my name's not Mo Farah. I was trafficked from Somalia when I was 9. I was given a piece of paper at Gatwick Airport and told to say this was my name, and effectively, this is this sort of terrible secret that I've had. I think fairly recently his wife knew about it. His kids still didn't know about it. But he decided it was time to tell the truth. And that was a difficult story to try and navigate. And in the end, we thought that actually creating a documentary that he would front an author about not just his story, but about the fact that he was one of possibly as many of 100,000 people a year who were being trafficked as children, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, into the UK, and that actually we could use this story to do something about that. And so we spent a year and a half making a film, and engaged with both the Home Office and Department of Health and Social Services to try and create an environment where a trafficked child would be less likely to be able to get into this country and stay underground. So it was I mean, you know, the media is becoming a much harder way of getting stories out into the public, partly because they're instantly looking for the story behind the story, because the media cycle moves so quickly that actually a good story that you break at 9 o'clock in the morning, by the afternoon has sort of moved into, well, oh, that's not the real story, there's another story, or here's a tangential story, or we don't agree with this story, or whatever. So trying to create content that can stand and be well crafted enough so that it defines the debate rather than ignites the debate. So increasingly we end up making our own content, partly because the media can't afford to do it anymore. I had an experience weirdly over the weekend with a really substantial publication, like, you know, Premier League global, about as big as it gets, who I'd offered an interview to in about 10 days' time, and this interview is about as good as an interview gets. And I sent him a message on Friday saying, oh, we've had to, move it by 2 days. And it was like, shit, I bought an unrefundable ticket. And actually I was only flying on that day because the tickets were cheaper that day. And I went, I'd been listening to Graydon Carter's autobiography, who goes through the editorial budgets at Vanity Fair in the early years, where people were spending 8 months at the Chateau Marmont and flying all over the world, and there was a point where serious pieces of media had 6- and 7-figure budgets, and I was genuinely shocked that a title of that caliber getting a exclusive of that caliber was likely not to happen because the ticket was non-refundable.
So will it happen? Are you going to make it work?
I think it will.
Zoom call.
But equally, they're much too proud to be able to.
Yeah.
I said, well, I can cover the cost of the ticket. Oh, we can't do that.
Okay.
But it's it's indicative of the fact that good journalism is expensive. And sometimes it's slow, and there are very, very few media outlets left that can afford to put a journalist on a story for any period of time, that can afford to have, photography that, is likely to elevate the piece, that are able to, have people travel to go and find a story, and then, what used to be a lengthy and expensive process of fact-checking and making sure that story was exactly what it was supposed to be, and they're just gone.
No, exactly. I mean, your other hat is obviously, as you say, a film producer, and if you think about probably the most amazing piece of PR in recent years is Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which changed an entire narrative on a very old and long-running saga, which was incredibly complex. Is that something you're actively now thinking about, how you can sort of combine storytelling with sort of messaging, I suppose?
Yeah, because they've got the budget. I mean, so I mean less and less, but I mean, what the most surprising thing about the Mr. Bates show was that the BBC didn't make it, and actually I think ITV were acknowledged last night at BAFTAs as solely for the fact that they actually had the guts to fund a program of that stature that clearly didn't have much international resonance, and they thought it was an important program to make, but I think probably film and TV are the last two places. We were partly partly involved in a movie called Ocean that opened in cinemas last week, which is Attenborough's last film, and is, you know, the most I mean, it's off the charts good, partly because it's Attenborough and he is a remarkable storyteller. But you know, you think about the cost of that 90 minutes of film, you know, shot over a year and a half, you know, in incredibly far-flung places. And you know, that's journalism that can only be afforded by TV, and the budgets that exist now to make television programs. It's sort of the last game in town.
Yeah.
And yet so little TV is made for any good reason, other than they've got a channel they need to fill.
Right. If budget was no issue, what would be the story or the issue that you'd like to shine a light on with a documentary or feature?
We created a TV channel called ReTV for then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, which we make about 50 films a year, just sort of short form documentaries about the optimistic or encouraging side of the fight against climate change. But I think where an issue requires a shift in public understanding and in some cases public behavior, you know, film and TV is possibly the only way of having a concentrated dialogue with the public, because you have their full attention in a, you know, immersive and you know, intense way of conveying information. Whereas if you're relying on, you know, doom scrolling through TikTok or Instagram or tweets or cheap journalism, which is a, you know, either an AI generated or overworked journalists' interpretation of a story. So yeah, I think if you look at the impact that films have made over the last, you know, 50 years, it's very often they're the catalyst for a genuine reimagining or a reframing of a public debate. So I think it definitely applies to climate. It applies to development. It applies to a better understanding of health, of diseases. I mean, you know, Richard Curtis, who you know, whose great mantra is whatever you do that to help whatever it is you care about. And so, you know, he made a gorgeous film about malaria that was a sort of romantic comedy about two women who came together because both of their children caught malaria and didn't die, but they didn't die because they lived in Western countries, and anyone who caught malaria in Africa was likely to die. He made another film about the G8 summit, which again was a romantic comedy, but that explained to people, this was in 2005, you know, why the Glen Eagles summit for the G8 was really critical. So I think it's a virtuous and engaging way of entertaining people and giving them information that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we talk about politics for a bit and the corridors of power? Freud has obviously worked with lots of government departments and governments itself. I guess in the 40 years since you've been doing this, the atmosphere of politics has changed greatly. And I think now the news cycle is one of scandal and catching politicians out and much less deferential towards powerful people than it was once upon a time, perhaps. Do you think that's a fair characterization? And is it possible to be a popular politician nowadays?
I mean, outside the mid-election cycle, it doesn't matter if politicians are popular. And I think if popularity is what you're going for, politics is an odd career choice. I also think if you're trying to do the right thing by a country, then you need to definitely not be swayed by what's popular. You need to be swayed by what's right. But I think I disagree with you about the changing nature of certainly the media narrative around politics. There's a very, very good book called The Chief, which is, I think written by Andrew Roberts, who was, it's a biography of the first Lord Northcliffe,
Right.
who started the Daily Mail in 1880-ish. And it's a brilliantly researched sort of charting of the level of influence that the Daily Mail amassed at the beginning of the 20th century, to the point where Lord Northcliffe became the Minister of Propaganda in the First World War and also managed Anglo-American relations. But at the end of his period working in government, he decided that he was much more powerful not being government, but just being the proprietor of the Daily Mail. And the level of influence that specifically he had by constantly attacking the government of the day, even if it was the government that he'd been instrumental in putting in, is a playbook that the Daily Mail continue to this day. But he also had a sort of mentee in Australia called Keith Murdoch, who used to dub himself Lord Southcliffe, who took exactly what the Daily Mail did and established that first in Australia, and then his descendants took it on the road. So I think the way that media exerts influence on politicians is to attack them constantly.
Yeah.
So the idea that you might momentarily be popular with the media, or that a story might play well, is actually an irrelevance. Certainly media owners who seek political influence will always attack you. And the only power that you have is how you respond to that. And the reason why it's an effective tactic is because it's incredibly distracting, so that you spend your time reacting to whatever the media are attacking you for, rather than getting on with the less newsworthy side of actually running a country. And there's also this this massive disparity between the time it takes to do anything significantly politically and a media who are trying to give a real-time analysis of what's happening. And so if you play the short-term immediate game at the expense of taking those longer-term decisions about steering the country in the right direction, then you'll be less likely to achieve anything.
And I guess the narrative is that the quality of our politicians has declined, because who would want to put themselves into that media climate at this moment?
I'm not sure enough as sort of analysis being given to that. It is remarkable how few people want to go into politics. I think, funny enough, I think if you look back to a different era, politics represented an opportunity for social mobility, certainly on the left. But I mean, an MP's salary is now 80,000.
Yeah, about 80. Yeah.
Which so I don't think anyone's going in because they think it's a great way to make a living. And then on the right, there was probably more a view of you made your money and then went into politics as a way of serving the public, and that tradition seems to have largely gone. Partly because I think individual politicians probably don't have a great deal of influence. But it's we seem to be moving more to an American style of more presidential politics than party politics.
Right. Yeah. And does that feel like a good thing?
Nothing feels like a good thing at the moment.
Well, that was sort of going to be my next question. I was listening to your newsagents episode of that podcast you were on recently, and you said very early on that you know too much about too much. I wonder how you look at the world, having advised all these clients from from politicians to famous people. Have you been made cynical by knowing so much?
No, actually. I don't recognize. I think the media and social media narrative tends to attribute the worst possible interpretation on anything that happens. I think the idea is that everyone in public life is self-serving. Every company is ripping off their customers and poisoning the environment and cares about nothing other than profit or shareholder return. That every celebrity is a hypocrite. That everyone who speaks out on a issue is secretly hiding some dark secret and shouldn't be allowed to express an opinion. That's not my experience. The vast majority of people who I encounter in positions of power, whether it's in business, in entertainment, creativity, or in politics or NGOs, are decent people. I think the vast majority of people are trying to be better, are trying to do the right thing in challenging circumstances. And I think this sort of collapse of public trust in virtually everything is misplaced. It may have been well placed with the last government. I think if you look at the current government, they're not in it for personal gain. I think the vast majority of people who go into politics want to make things better, and so to be attacked from literally day one of this government coming into power for taking free Taylor Swift tickets or having someone pay for a pair of glasses, or it was just an attempt to reinforce this idea that the public have that they're all a bunch of bastards.
Right.
And that and similarly, any CEO is seen how much they're paid, or what car they drive, or the decisions they've had to make that are going to put people out of a job or whatever, or anyone in entertainment who seeks to use that platform to talk about something they care about is a terrible hypocrite because they're unfaithful to their wife, or they're taking a private jet when they're telling people about the environment. It's this idea that you can undermine anyone by pointing out some human flaw in their personality, which diminishes whatever it is that they're trying to say, that might contribute to a positive debate. So I think there's a gulf between the motivation of the vast majority of people in public life and the media and probably public's interpretation of their entirely self-serving motivation.
Right. And at the same time, I've heard you say that we're living in a new age of indifference, which seems to me like it's its own problem. Do you think that's still the case?
I think it would. I think it's when people are absorbing this tsunami of information. At a point where you read a newspaper in the morning and watched the TV news in the evening, and maybe read a supplement at weekends, that was was probably a proportionate amount of external information to come into your life. Most of it not terribly relevant. The fact that our media digest at the moment is driven by Ukraine, by Gaza, by Washington, by Vatican City, by Yemen. These are not relevant things to most people's lives. and yet they induce a sense of uncertainty and anxiety that I think is a really negative backdrop. If you live in rural England, if you sort of live anywhere, what's relevant is what's happening in your community. What's relevant is what's happening in your family. It's like the fact that local media is gone, like gone. When I started, any junior person joining Freuds or joining any PR company would work on regional newspapers. There were hundreds and hundreds of regional newspapers that did a really important job of telling people what was going on in their communities. That is relevant information. And there is no longer apparently a business in regional media, and therefore apparently no need for regional media. There were regional radio stations, which are now centrally and algorithmically programmed just to play music and be a universal product with almost no localization at all. I think that the differentiation between news that is relevant to people's lives and information they need to know against what the best, most dramatic, most anxiety-inducing story that there is in the global sort of spectrum it's a really weird diet for people to choose, because terrible as what is going on in many parts of the world is, it's not going to have much impact if you live in the Cotswolds or the Midlands or up north or in Wales or whatever. So I think it must be a surreal existence to see that the global debate is so far removed from people's everyday lives. There was a sort of Reithian tradition at the BBC where the BBC was sort of established with a very precise and sort of ethical view on what information it was useful to give people. It's sort of why British soap operas were about working class communities and values. Coronation Street, EastEnders, Crossroads in my day. American soaps were about billionaire lifestyles and, cutthroat business or whatever. That idea of there being some responsibility of being the filter between information that people, wanted and what they needed. And we seem to be so out of balance on that in that people are genuinely consumed by these global issues that just don't have anything to do with their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I open it up to the audience, then I want to ask you the other side of that question. What makes you really optimistic about the world, knowing everything that you know? And I guess the part B to that is, if there was a 21-year-old like you right now, somewhere in the world, starting out, possibly in PR, possibly in something else, what would your one piece of advice to them about getting on in the world be?
It definitely wouldn't be PR. But I think I've been saying that almost since I started. I think probably travel. I think we're in a pretty dark period. I think the arc of our island nation over the last. I love the fact that in 41 years, in 2066, we'll have had 1,000 years of this sort of singular 5-year break for Cromwell, but basically from William the Conqueror to, I guess, either William or George, who will be on the throne, which is a virtually unbroken bloodline. And you can look at the rise of the British Empire and at the fall of the British Empire, and then into sort of devolution and into the sort of redactive modern history where we've become smaller and smaller and smaller. It would be hard to be optimistic about a country that clearly needs to reinvent itself, redefine itself, and rebuild itself. And that goes for our education system, our health system, our roads, and the fact that we no longer have much domestic industry. A combination of AI and tech disruption is going to be really challenging. The amount of debt that we have, it's going to be a slog here for the foreseeable future. But there are countries around the world where they're absolutely in the ascendancy. So I think there's no great tradition of travel here, particularly if you I think most people who were born in London probably stay in London their whole lives. In America, chances are you were born in one state, you'll go to college in another, you'll probably get your first job in somewhere else again. You might move 3 or 4 times. Other than probably people migrating down to London, there isn't that culture of going and sort of breaking out of the postcode that you were born into. So. I think now would be a good time to travel.
Okay, brilliant, good advice. And finally, what makes you optimistic now in this moment?
My kids, I think there's a generation who aren't cynical. I think they're critical of their sort of economic and cultural and environmental inheritance. I think they hold our generation entirely responsible, but they are they're motivated, they're creative in the main. I think if you look at any time there's an economic recession. I mean, my company was born out of the fact that there weren't a lot of prospects. I think the flip side to any economic downturn is that the barriers to entry for people getting out and trying to create something or do something for themselves is easier. So I'm hoping the next generation gets us out of it.
Wonderful. Okay, me too. Brilliant. Well, thank you, Matthew. And let's open it up to some questions if anyone's got any. We've got a floating microphone, which is always quite good fun. Who'd like to ask a question? Okay. Yes, this lady here in the red dress. Thanks, Harvey.
You very briefly just touched on it, but AI and comms, and what's your approach to it, and what would how do you see that forming lots of strategies?
I think AI and marketing is a much more existential challenge. Zuckerberg is now basically positioning Meta as a full service marketing product to brand owners who he can basically say, well, just, okay, tell me what your products are, and we will create personalized advertising for every single person of the 3.5 billion on our platform. And they'll get better and better and better because we can track whether or not they work and how well they're received. So I think if you're in what we used to call above the line, if you're sort of buying the attention of your audience through media who are no longer able to deliver those eyeballs in quite the same way, then I think AI is probably a death knell. I think if you distill PR or comms down to its most basic function, it's about storytelling. and I think storytellers will endure. I think that they always have, and so I always used to say, like a PR story has to be two things. It has to be true and it has to be interesting. And I think being able to divine an interesting truth that will allow a message or a product or an idea to connect with its public is something that AI will probably do poorly for the foreseeable future. It'll work it out. But I think we did a dinner for a bunch of arts institutions for Bank of America last week, and as with every conversation, how is AI going to affect, insert subject name here, and there was one quite good quote, which is if you look at AI at the moment, AI should start with a human and AI should end with a human, and I think for certainly for the next cycle of the convergence of AI and a non-AI world, the AI as a tool for humans to do whatever they do better, more efficiently, cheaper, and quicker than they did it before will be broadly a good thing. I think when you get to full automation, we're all in trouble.
Okay, wonderful. Any other questions out there? This lady here in the yellow. Feel free to shout it, or you can wait.
Hi. I thought that was great, by the way, really interesting. So PR comms has always been typically very hard to quantify exactly in terms of value to the client, i.e. financial value. And my experience is that even 10 years ago, my clients would say, okay, what's the readership, what's the AVE, much contested. But really, I'd have a feeling that they wanted to see themselves in the FT, and that was kind of actually the value to them sometimes. Do you think now, with all the data available and everything that we can access, is PR or comms ever fully 100% quantifiable to the client?
So there was a period where digital advertising was taking a huge amount of share from non-digital advertising, and because digital advertising was trackable, and you could work out whether people were clicking and whether people were engaging, and then indeed when people were buying, and they managed to prove that digital advertising didn't work. And so there was this huge swing back to non-digital advertising, which apparently you can't prove doesn't work, but it's fucking obvious it doesn't. I mean, there's still $120 billion a year spent on free-to-air advertising on American TV networks, wow, which are unwatchable. I mean, I don't know if you ever. I mean, literally, it is impossible to watch American free-to-air, TV. So I look, PR has never sufficiently rattled the cages of overall marketing budgets, so that one had to either much to gain or fear from scrutiny as to whether it was contributing. I think if you reduce the core product of PR to being about crafting narrative and storytelling, then I think it elevates up to something that actually genuinely defines and allows companies to articulate their own values and their own, engagement with consumers. And so I think I would be broadly optimistic about the trajectory of that narrative storytelling part of comms, as opposed to the smoke and mirrors of repetition and frequency, which is what every other marketing discipline effectively sells, because because you can reduce it to inventory and you can reduce it to data. That's the lowest hanging fruit for AI. Where you're able to fairly instantly do things that would have taken a large number of people a lot of time to execute. Whereas the value of a good story that connects people with ideas it's much harder to measure. Hence, your evaluation is a tough thing, but it's also much harder to replicate with machine intelligence.
Wonderful. Any more questions? Probably got time for one more. Anyone want to squeeze one in? This chap over here, brilliant.
You've spoken about fame and celebrity. Do you think there's a point at which we lose our insatiable appetite to see celebrities and have famous individuals? Or is that just part of the human condition?
I think we lost it a long time ago in the. I mean, to me, sort of fame or heroes, right? Which have been an essential part of every community for thousands of years, right? There were always gods. There were always people of legend. There were always these aspirational figures around, whom stories were told, that elevated the sort of perceived peaks of the human condition, and that sort of chosen hero, that idea that people could aspire to greatness. And those people became slightly more manufactured when media began to accelerate. But the early heroes were definitely created in partnership with media. The Hollywood stars, were allowed to be perfect. They were allowed to be airbrushed into these heroic figures. Politicians were allowed to have the same human failings as everyone else, but for that not to deflect the idea that we could believe in them as people who were serving their country and standing up for the values that they espoused. It's somewhere around the sort of post-Watergate era, where Watergate may have been one of the first instances where media made news rather than reported it, and that caught on because it was more fun and cheaper, and so the story that had endured for millennia, which was about heroic acts of ordinary people, inverted to the point where the media reported on someone who you admired having a failing or a human frailty or a fault. And so rather than the media using celebrity fame or heroes as a way of giving people something to believe in, they actually used it as a way of undermining that idea that there were people who were great or who were aspirational, who were, who gave you hope. And they're now, there's barely anyone on earth who hasn't had their turn, right? Attenborough, maybe. But come up with a random celebrity, you'll remember that time when he got caught doing that, or he was exposed for doing that, or he was attacked for doing this or whatever. So I wish the world would sort of rediscover that role. Religion has largely sort of sidestepped that idea of giving people a sort of sense of hope and morality around aspirational behavior. And because the media is very partisan, it doesn't really allow anyone to look like a hero anymore. So I think the role of fame has fundamentally changed from one that had an important role in society to one that is now used to undermine sort of belief in humanity.
Excellent.
That's a depressing note.
It is. Well, let's end on a positive note then. Matthew, you said earlier that good stories should be both true and interesting. Is that right? Yeah. I think we can all agree that this has been incredibly candid and open and honest, but also really, really fascinating. So hopefully that's a suitably positive note to end on. Thank you all for coming, but thank you especially to Mr. Matthew Freud for giving us his time.